For those of you who don't know me, I'm the irascible Mr. Fenster. Thank you very much. Welcome, Mr. Pardlo. May I call you? I'd like to thank Greg Pardlo for coming here today. I haven't shared this with anybody or with many people, but Greg and I know each other have known each other for many, many years. Since the 90s, or was it the 80s? Something. 91. We went to college together at Rutgers University, and Greg served, besides being a very good friend, served a really pivotal purpose for me, or filled a role for me that was really very important. In that, when you guys, many of you, if not all of you, go to college, you'll have conversations into the wee hours of the night where there is no bedtime, and you stay up and you have philosophical conversations and talk to 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And Greg and I worked on the newspaper, the Rutgers Review, together for a couple of years. And we would be editing the newspaper, and then we'd sit out in the hall and we'd talk. And we'd get inexorably, we'd be drawn to discussions about race in America. And there would be times where I would want to ask a question, and I would stop myself because I was concerned that I might say something offensive. And Greg was always very quick to assure me that, no, it's okay, you can ask me anything, I'm not going to get offended by your question. I'd rather you ask me something ignorant and I'll explain it to you, or I'll give you an answer, and hopefully you can do the same for me. So that, and along with a few other people who did the same sort of thing for me as well, people who were open to discussions, I felt it made a huge difference in how I saw the world. So half of the audience wasn't here for earlier today, but we had another guest speaker who had an open thread of questions that were posted, questions and comments that were posted anonymously, and unfortunately there were some grossly inappropriate comments that were made, some of which had racial overtones, or should be called racial epithets. So I'm just going to throw it over to Greg and not even ask a question other than, what are your thoughts here? Were you the least bit surprised by a suburban New Jersey high school sounding like an Alabama high school?
No. Yes. No, I wasn't surprised because I grew up in South Jersey, and I didn't make it a habit to go around telling people, I'll be your font of African American information for the next 2 hours. Ask me anything. No, it wasn't something I just ordinarily do. I was interested in talking with Bob, and he and I sat up having these conversations because I'm the first person in my family to go to college. When I got there, there was in the paper that he was, you were the editor-in-chief, you were the managing editor. They published an article about Nelson Mandela, and the headline was that Nelson Mandela is a seditious terrorist. And my head exploded. And I wrote a letter to the editor, just out of sheer rage and rant, and something I had never done before. I didn't know, like I said, I didn't know anything about college. It was an entirely new environment for me. I had no one advising me at home of what to do, or just really quick. My first day of school, at the end of, I scheduled all my classes from like 8 to 3, 8 in the morning, which is insane. You don't do that. And at the end of the day, I went back to the room where my first class was, because I thought that was my homeroom. I thought you still had homeroom in college. That's how oblivious I was. Sad, right? Yes, we can have pity for little Greg. And so when I wrote this letter off to the editor, and I got a phone call from Bob saying, not only would you like to write something else, but would you come and write for the newspaper? And this was just incredible, and very rarely Well, actually, you'll hear people say a lot. Writers will say, "Well, I credit so and so for getting me into writing," and it's all bullshit, right? So it's none of that's ever true. But in this case, I credit Bob quite a bit for my becoming a writer. It was the first time I was ever able to have conversations like that. And so I wanted an environment, I wanted a relationship in which there was mutual respect, right? And I knew I had plenty of dumb things to say, plenty of dumb questions, because I came from a place where, we were a very insular community. Right? We were very provincial in our thinking, and so I had a lot to learn, and thank goodness he had a lot to learn, because that just evened it all out. Now, to the point of this morning, no, I'm not surprised. This is us. And we hear people saying, you see these horrible things happening around in society, and you say, "This is not who we are." Yeah, fool. Yes, it is. That's exactly who we are. Yes, it is. Right? And part of the problem is this resistance, this insistence that this is not who we are. No, when we do that, all that means is I refuse to look at this, I refuse to think about this, I refuse to process it, right? And then the stuff just festers. So I'm not surprised on the one hand, and it's a high school. Do dumb stuff. Did you do dumb stuff when you were a kid?
I did not.
I did enough dumb stuff.
All right, let's go to the proper interview here. Do you remember how old you were the first time you tried to write poetry? Was it your middle school hip-hop phase?
No, actually, so he's referring to a story I often tell in interviews where it was about 7th grade, I started writing rap lyrics because I thought it was cool, and it was cool, actually. To be honest.
Was it good?
They were not good. It was not good at all. But the truth is, I was a romantic kid. I used to, when I was in like 3rd and 4th grade, I'd go out into the woods. I had my little Polaroid camera. I'd take pictures of snow on trees. And I'd write about the snow on the merry-go-round in the playground. Yes. And so,
all right. So when was it good? When was the first thing you wrote? When was the first thing you wrote where you stopped and you went, not bad?
High school. In high school. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't. I can't say I was writing good poems overall, but I knew there were moments I could sense when the thing I was writing on the page seemed to do something that I didn't feel I was entirely in control of. When the language did something that seemed of its own volition and surprised me. And that was the feeling I wanted to keep getting, that surprise.
I just popped into my head an old memory. The newspaper also had an annual or a semester, every semester we did a poetry literature magazine. And Greg, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet, submitted a poem. He wasn't the prize winner at that point, which our editors decided was not good enough for it. And then when he came in after the writing, I think it was after writing the letter to the editor the first time that he actually came into the office, there actually wasn't, "Oh, he's black." Because it changed the way that they perceived the poem. They didn't.
Never told me that story.
I didn't.
Never told me that story. That's fascinating.
Andrew,
you may have told me and I forgot, but that's fascinating.
A lot of forgotten things back in those years. When it comes to in terms of your writing process, do you have tons of unfinished ideas that you keep coming back to, or do you get an idea and say, I have to finish this and focus on it until it's done?
Well, I try to be as disciplined as I can and work through something when. So inspiration is a myth. Once you get to a certain point, you can't wait for inspiration. It is put your butt in the chair and start writing, and you write until you make something happen. Right? And so most of writing is just an act of sheer discipline and will. And so yes, I keep a lot of. I do get moments of inspiration, and I am diligent to hurry up and scribble whatever inspiration has given me, has provoked in me. But as far as developing full poems or essays or whatever I'm working on, that's just a matter of habit.
When you find inspiration elusive, and you're trying to be disciplined and trying, it's like it's time to write something, and it's just not coming. I find for myself, more in terms of music composition, that when the world's an open book and there are no constraints, I can't come up with anything. That I do better if I impose rules and say it has to be this, it has to be within these confines. Does that sort of thing work for you, or how do you approach that?
Yeah, well, that's one technique. I mean, every writer has their own kind of toolbox of things that they go back to just like an athlete does calisthenics, stretches and warms up. When I sit down at my desk in the morning, I will translate poems that are from a language that I don't know. So I will get, German at this point is not entirely foreign, right? But so I'll take some Rilke or something, a poet in German, take down my German-English dictionary, and just force myself to go through and try to make sense of the poem in the other language. That process gets me out of the routine habits of language in my head, and that's the thing that I want to do, right? And so when inspiration is elusive, as you say, it's because I'm just stuck in a loop of kind of cliched and routine thinking.
It brings to mind, I remember reading, when I read Nabokov, something by Nabokov, I noticed that, I saw in the forward that it was the first book he had written in English. And the idea, and I read I skipped the introduction and I just read the book, and then I came back and I read that. And I was struck by Nabokov's amazing language choices. I think we actually talked a little bit about this once. And the whole point of it ultimately was that because he wasn't writing in his native language, he made choices that were very unusual.
Very unconventional use of language, right? And we see that as brilliant. I mean, it is brilliant. I'm in no way suggesting he had a sort of first-timer's luck at it. But there is something to be said for having some distance from the language as it is used idiomatically and colloquially, right? And so much of, particularly in my poetry, so much of my work is trying to, like I said, get out of the cliched blocks of language, right? So I think, and this is probably true for most people in the room, we think in phrases and blocks of language that are already set up, and we're just kind of shuttling them back and forth. I mean, you can hear what's going to come next, right? And that's a problem with good writing, right? And you want the reader to pay attention to every word. You want the reader to be engaged with every word, and that means you have to surprise. You have to say something unconventional. You have to say it in unconventional ways.
Fantastic segue. My favorite poem of yours comes from your first book, Totem. When I heard you read Double Dutch, I was struck by the string of allusions and similes, a veritable whirlwind of cultural references. If we were here under different circumstances with more time, I'd spend a half hour unpacking each of those images and talking about that, but let's have you read it before I ask you a question about it.
All right. Double Dutch. The girls turn in double Dutch, bob and weave like boxers, pulling punches, shadowing each other, sparring across the slack cord, casting parabolas in the air. They whip quick as an infant's pulse, and the jumper, before she enters the winking, nods in time as if she has a notion to share, waiting her chance to speak. But she's anticipating the upbeat, like a band leader, counting off the tune they are about to swing into. The jumper stair steps into midair, as if she's jumping rope in low gravity, training for a lunar mission. Airborne a moment long enough to fit a second thought in, she looks caught in the mouth bones of a fish as she flutter floats into motion, like a figure in a stack of time-lapse photos thumbed alive. Once inside, the bells tied to her shoestrings rouse the gods who've lain in the dust since the Dutch acquired Manhattan. How she dances patterns like a dust-heavy bee, retracing its travels in scale before the hive. How the whole stunning contraption of girl and rope slaps and scoops like a paddle boat. Her misted skin arranges the light with each adjustment and flex, now heather-hued, now sheen, light listing on the fulcrum of a wrist and the bare, jutted joints of elbow and knee and the faceted surfaces of muscle, surfaces fracturing and reforming like a sun-tickled sleeve of running water. She makes jewelry of herself and garlands the ground with shadows.
This poem about a girl jumping rope works in allusions to boxing, jazz, space exploration, fish, bees, and on and on. That final line...
And the Dutch.
And the Dutch taking Manhattan. And probably others, but that final line kills me. And what I'm going to ask you now, in a way, connects to some extent to something we're going to be doing later. What's the initial inspiration? I mean, is it merely there's a girl jumping rope, or is there how does it go from initial idea, visualization? I'll stop talking.
Well, so that poem was inspired by seeing girls jumping rope and thinking, oh my God, this is operatic. The orchestra of this thing, this activity, the coordination, the near clairvoyance between all three of them as they make this ballet happen. And I wanted to sort of honor that. And so I started working on the poem. That poem took me probably 3 years to write. And for a long time, it went into, so the things that you hear, the allusions to boxing, there was a whole digression on Muhammad Ali and the rumble in the jungle. There was the allusions to space exploration. There was a whole thing on Buzz Aldrin, this long digression. It was like a 5-page poem early on. And over time, I just kept boiling it down to the one single core image that I thought was most essential, and layered them that way.
Totem, your first book, came out in 2007 to high acclaim. And it took you just mentioned it took 3 years to write just the one poem in there. I assume you were writing other things.
Right, exactly, yeah.
Otherwise, you'd be 800 years old by the time you published a book. But it took you 7 years before you finished your follow-up digest, which won something called the Pulitzer Prize in 2015. The Pulitzer Committee wrote that your book featured clear-voiced poems that bring readers the news from 21st century America, rich with thought, ideas, and histories, public and private. So my question for you is one that I also think about sometimes is, how do you stay humble, and can you accept accolades at face value, or do you psychologically kind of brush them off?
Well, I mean, first of all, the stereotype about, the cliche about poets is that we're depressed and neurotic, and that's actually true to a large extent. So, I hear, there's the sane, kind of well-adjusted part of me that moves through the world professionally and gets things done. But then there's the deeply neurotic side and this is in no way limited to me. This is a very common thing. Once I sit down, everybody faces the blank page. And the anxiety of facing a blank page is, as far as in my experience, damn near universal. And to put something on that page requires a great deal of humility. Because you have to put something down, and then you have to face the fact that it sucks. So what I just wrote is god awful. So now what do I do, right? And you have to be in the practice of being humble before the language, and I hate to keep using this word, but to honor the language, and to put the language above ego. That said, yeah, it's cool getting patted on the back and traveling around, and it's not like I'm a rock star. It's not like I get to throw TVs off the balcony.
You had kids come right up to you wanting to shake your hand and touch the oak.
Yeah, that's always cool. That's always cool. But but it's
okay.
It's not a rock star life.
Yep. Okay, so your latest work, Air Traffic, is a collection of essays that together form a memoir, and most of the room has read parts of it. Did the decision to write the memoir have anything to do with pressure you might have felt following up an award-winning book? I mean, how does one follow Blonde on Blonde or Songs in the Key of Life?
No, because I started writing that book well before. So Digest was signed to the publisher in 2012. It came out in 2014. It won the prize in 2015. I was already writing Air Traffic by 2011. And so in fact, in some sense, I had already given up on Digest. I had set it aside and wasn't thinking about it.
Well, I believe if your press is accurate, that every major publisher passed on Digest.
Every major publisher passed on Digest, yeah.
Good job.
Yeah, and I mean, again, to the humility, and it takes a lot to to keep in mind that none of this is personal, right? The rejections of Digest were not rejections of me personally, and so I was already working on the new stuff.
They are rejecting you.
They are rejecting, that's yes.
The title of your memoir comes in part from your family history, starting with your grandfather in Oklahoma. About half of the audience has read chapter 2 of the book, but for those who didn't, let's do the Cliff's Notes version. First, what happened in Tulsa in 1921, and how does that lead into your grandfather's experience?
Well, that was, that little piece of history was something I discovered. I had heard about it, I kind of knew about it in the back of my head. But as I was researching my grandfather's experience in Oklahoma, I was thinking, well, what else was going on in Oklahoma? I'd never been to Oklahoma. I don't know anything about the history there. So through my research, I came across this anecdote of the Tulsa massacre, in which airplanes, this was it 1921, 21, air travel was very new then. And this is not my grandfather got to Oklahoma in like 54 or something like that, maybe earlier, but in the 40s. But this incident would have been very much in the minds of people in Oklahoma when my grandfather arrived to train for the Federal Aviation Administration.
And the incident being rich white people who had access to airplanes.
They owned airplanes and used these airplanes to drop bombs of, basically there was flaming balls of tar on the wealthy black community there. Now, Oklahoma was a wealthy state at the time because oil was just discovered and everybody was flush. And so the black community in Tulsa was, according to historians, the wealthiest black community in the country at the time. And it was bombed. So the irony of this being the place where my grandfather goes to train, and this being the place where the first aerial attack on American soil takes place, seemed unavoidable to me.
The chapter focuses a bit on how he dealt with social expectations of the time period. And this is a question that probably demands more time than we have to give, but I'll ask it anyway. How has your own experiences in your life, pick any one of them or multiple of them, differed in terms from your grandfather, or differed or paralleled his grappling with people's expectations of himself? Because I think that was a theme that you hit upon about.
Yeah. So one of the things I was interested in the book was the changing perceptions of race over time, and I think it's a misperception to think that America has always been racist in the very same way for the last 400 years. It hasn't. In fact, our perceptions, our conceptions of race have changed over time, and that's something that fascinated me. So the perception of what blackness is and what a black identity how one should perform a black identity for my generation is extremely different from what the expectations were for my grandfather. Now, my grandfather is also coming from Philadelphia, which was racist in very different ways, but going to a segregated place like Oklahoma, he experienced a substantial amount of culture shock, right? So geographically, race is constructed differently, and temporally, race is constructed differently. And I wanted to think about how dynamic our identities are, in fact, right, as opposed to the assumption that identity is something static or fixed in some way.
I think sometimes we think our parents are like everyone else. I always joke about when I hear a student say something, Hillsborough sucks. Like, compared to what? What experience do you have? How many parents do you have that you're comparing them to whom? But your father was not a normal person in a lot of different ways. A large portion of your book is about grappling with your complicated relationship, a complex cocktail of love, fear, resentment, and idolatry. When would you say you began to comprehend that this driven, troubled, outsized character of a man was unique, was different from other people's dads?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, yeah, probably not until I was in high school or even in college. Because to me, right, being in the family and not having much or not thinking about how he related to other fathers, he was just a difficult man, and this was the circumstance I was born into, and I deal with it, and everybody deals with their own parents, fine. But then as I got older and meeting people whose parents were invested, so my father was very deeply narcissistic, right? And his idea was, look, I got you to 18, now get the hell out of my house, right? And I thought that was normal. And he wasn't invested. It was a shock and a surprise to me to discover that there are parents in the world who would, for example, spend thousands of dollars to cheat to get their kids into college. It just never occurred to me. It was a shock and a surprise to me that there were parents in the world who would spend money on SAT prep, right? Who does that kind of thing, right? And I just thought, you did everything by the seat of your pants. Whatever you got in your pockets, that's what you got. Go into the world and figure it out. But so yeah, it took a while before I started to see that people were invested in subsequent generations in ways that were unfamiliar to me.
The book's title chapter tells your father's story during the air traffic controller strike in 1981. Why did you choose to pulp fiction this chapter and come at it from in a non-linear chronology?
Yeah. So I didn't. I'm not a historian, and I'm not a labor theorist. So I didn't want. I wanted to foreground my lens as a poet, and so while I wanted to tell the story of the strike, I didn't want to pretend that I was creating some definitive document or some definitive argument about who was right in the strike, who should have won, where our sympathies should lie. As with much of my poetry, I just wanted to complicate our views of the strike. Right? I think those who were alive at the time and who remember will often have very two-dimensional views of the strike. They'll think, well, Reagan, what a scumbag! Hey, how he just fired all those people. I never forgave him for that. Or the union. Unions suck. Unions have always sucked, and that was the moment it proved that we shouldn't have unions, or unions are ineffective, or whatever. And I wanted to complicate our perceptions of the value of unions, why unions come together, what the human affective, emotional experience of being committed to a community means. Right? And then I think, of course, my long-term idea was that I'm making a commentary on how we construct ourselves as a nation, right? How we construct the we that is the United States of America.
So, I should follow up on that, but I'm not going to. Because come back to it.
Oh, okay.
I want to stick with your father for a bit. He went from a position of great importance, first in just generally the job of air traffic controller is such an enormously important, stressful job with the lives of so many people literally in your hands. Yeah. And then also as a spokesperson for the union. And he went from that position of great importance to having completely lost it, which included the ability to support your family. And you wrote that he always carried a wounded quality he never quite shook. And you wrote a poem about this time period, also from your first book, that I would like you to read, if you would indulge us.
Sure. Yeah, I'm also thinking about masculinity. I'm thinking about our sense of, so we know this term intersectionality, right? And so my father's, I wanted to think about how my father's identity was impacted by his loss of the loss of his job. This poem came long before. In fact, in a lot of ways, this poem is the genesis, thank you, of air traffic. Winter after the strike. Perhaps we are each a cresting echo, hesitating, vibrant with the moment before rippling back. But you are steadfast as Odysseus, strapped to the mast, as you were in '81 when Reagan ordered you back to work. You were president of the union local, you steered with your working man's voice, the voice that ground the Ptolemaic ballet of air traffic to a temporary stop. You used it to refuse to cross the picket line I walked with you outside Newark International. I could see the dark turnpike for miles, the somber office buildings, winking insomniac cells, the tarmac spread before us like a picnic blanket, and you, like a jade Buddha, suffused in the glow of that radial EKG. You pushed the microphone in front of me, nod, and let me give the word. I called all my stars home, trajectories bent on the weight of my voice. You say you miss tracking those leviathans, each one snagged on the barb of your liturgy. I too get reeled in by the hard, now rusty music of your pipes. I follow it back to the day of your accident and the story you tell. You were 16, hurdling the railing, dividing row house porches from one end of Widener Place to the other to impress Mom. I imagine the way you cleared each one, like a leaf bobbing on water, catching the penultimate, the rubber toe of your Chuck Taylors kissed by the rail, upsetting your rhythm, and you roiled in the air, headlong, arms outstretched, stumbling toward the last, like one hell-bent or sick to the stomach. The way you landed on your throat, the rail could have taken your head clean off. Since then, your voice issues like some wartime communique, a ragged, typewritten dispatch which you swallow with your smoker's cough, black as a tire spinning in the snow. That winter after the strike, we were so poor, you sold everything but the house. Tell me, Dad, when you'd stand at the door calling me in for the night, could you hear me speaking to snowflakes falling beneath the lamppost? Could you hear me out there, imitating you, imitating prayer?
So you were 13 years old at the time of the strike, and it seems only natural in general that you might want to emulate your father.
Right.
How much of your imitation of him was informed by an actual understanding of the larger political, economic, personal circumstances, and how much of it was just the natural, he's my dad?
At the time when I was 13?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Yeah, he was just entirely a heroic figure to me. My father stood up to the President of the United States. You can't get much cooler than that, you know. And there were FBI men parked out front of our house. They would follow me around the neighborhood as I skateboard around to my friend's house. They'd come up to the door and knock on the door, see if my dad was home, because the strike was illegal, and so all of the men and women who went on strike were criminals. And so my dad was fleeing the law. And I mean, it was just an entirely romantic thing. Now, long retrospect, yeah, that had a lot to do, it was very formative in my sense of my politics and, again, my sense of commitment to a communal cause, a shared cause. I think that's a heroic thing to commit one's life to others.
So, one thing I've always wondered about, and particularly when we look at a poem like this one, which is so incredibly, not just personal, but so specific, do you consider your audience and whether or not a poem like that will resonate with people who don't share those specific experiences or reference points? Or do you think that the emotions that you're evoking, like what you were just talking about, are so universal that people will get it, even though their dad was not a PATCO representative?
Yeah, no, and in fact, that's why I could always I could always imagine somebody not liking the poem. Why would I do that? So I imagine people who are coming to the poem for the same reasons that I come to poems, to all literature, and that is to learn a different way to see my own life, right? And that is, I want someone else's very specific experience so that it can help contextualize what I'm experiencing. Ultimately, yeah, I think these emotions, the core emotions, are all universal, right? We have fathers, we have mothers, we have envy and ambition, and all these stories are centered on some fundamental human emotion. So I write as specifically as I possibly can, so that, and I can hear some of my students sometimes will often say, well, I wanted to keep it vague so that people could imagine their way into the poem. So then now you're just making the reader do all the work, right? So it's actually the opposite. The more specific you are, the more a reader can come in and actually see the kind of the concreteness of the poem.
speaking of kind of the universal emotions, I think everyone craves the approval of their parents. Some of us are blessed with parents who regularly provide us with positive affirmations, and some of us are you and me. To be fair, my mom's been really good the last few years. I am filming this, so I'd like to see someone. What was it that your father texted you when he found out that you had won the Pulitzer Prize?
So I told you my dad was narcissistic. He died in 2016, but he obviously lived long enough to know that I'd won the Pulitzer, and I didn't hear from him. He competed with me in his own way, which was absolutely ridiculous, and it was something that I wasn't aware of. I was probably aware of it. You don't actually consciously think about these things until there's some distance. So my dad hadn't said anything about it since I think a week or so had gone by. So I texted him. I said, "Did you hear the news?" And he texted me back, when a Roman general conquered a town, Caesar would send a slave to ride alongside that general to remind him he's only human. That's it. That was his entire response.
Thanks, Dad.
Okay, all right.
Don't forget you suck.
So yeah, I don't. Thinking back to your earlier question about staying humble. So yeah, I don't have any problem finding the humble.
Senior was working on making sure that didn't go to your head.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. This book Digest was largely written around my getting sober. I am an alcoholic, and in around 2011 I stopped drinking, and the poems are about coming to terms with being a father, like when I just had 2 small kids, and the responsibility that suggested, and my anxieties and neuroses, just in general. How do I become a responsible person in the world when I think I'm such a scumbag, right? And so the poems are infused with that anxiety and that tension.
Next question.
So, hi.
Hi.
So to any aspiring writers here, including myself, what advice would you give us today?
So the advice that I often give, you're going to hear all the regular advice of, read. That's certainly important. But if I can say anything alternative to that, is travel. Travel, and that doesn't mean necessarily travel around the globe. That means, travel to some place where you are not the norm. Right? Somewhere where all of your expected clues and cultural assumptions are not in place, and so you will have to contend with, you have to face all of your cultural assumptions and figure out what those cultural assumptions are, and figure out a way to relate to the environment that isn't relying on other people, assuming that somebody else is going to just get me or get what I'm saying.
Thank you.
Yeah.
More questions?
Okay, so I'm also thinking of writing at some point in the future, especially like a memoir. Like I'm really into that. So my main question, I guess, is how did you write about your family and stuff without them being why did you put that in the book?
Let me just repeat the question a little bit. She, if you didn't hear in the back, how did you write about the family without the backlash or concern about their feelings? Because she's interested in writing a memoir herself.
So as I mentioned, my father was narcissistic. So he was like, "Yeah, of course you want to write about me." That took care of that. My mother is an artist and my mother was the strange kind of hippie-ish person who was like, you can do anything. And so she was always cool. And other than that, I mean, you know, my family, most people in my family are either artists primarily in some way or do something tangential to their regular lives that is in the arts. And so my being a writer was just like, oh, that's Greg's thing. Yeah, we're going to show up in his poems. Yeah, so it's just understood. The question gets a little different when I think about writing about my kids, because they don't have the agency to say, you know, don't write about me, because they've never known any different. And that's a little trickier question that I'm still grappling with. You know, it's like putting pictures of your kids on Instagram. And at some point they're going to grow up and be like, why the hell did you do that?
Especially the bathtub photos.
Especially the bathtub photos, yeah. But they're so cute.
More questions on this side. One of you fight it out.
Do you have any tips about writing a memoir, like where to start, like what you're going to write about?
Tips about writing a memoir, where to start?
Yeah, so the way I went about writing mine was I did not try to write a cradle to grave kind of narrative, right? I started with something that I was interested in. In fact, I started with the air traffic control strike, right? And so there's an idea that I'm interested in that involves my life profoundly. And so that was how I got into it. And the other chapter/essays in the book were all similarly, there's an idea about home ownership. My wife and I, when we bought our house in 2005, it was the first time either of us, it was the first time anyone had owned a property in her family, and what does it mean to own property? And so I was just fascinated with the question, rather than, this kind of gets to your question earlier about not sort of saying, look at me, this is about me. I'm more interested in the cultural phenomena, the philosophical question, or whatever it is that involves me, and I'm using myself as a lens to talk about that thing.
In the back.
Did you feel that any of your father's or grandfather's experiences impacted you as a writer?
Yeah, absolutely. I think about how hard my life is, and then I imagine my grandfather going to Oklahoma City, right, and having to, so the campus where the academy was, of course, Oklahoma is segregated. He could not ride the bus at all. There was no bus that my grandfather could take to the academy. They didn't allow him to eat lunch on the campus. So he not only had to walk to the academy, but he had to walk out to get lunch and or eat his lunch outside of the cafeteria. And people were kicking dirt at him, calling him all kinds of awful names. And I think about my father as an activist, and all of the work that he did, not only as a student activist, but also as a labor activist. And yeah, I can step up my game.
Nora.
Good, okay.
You'll get that person next, but.
Alright, so when reading Air Traffic, and like you guys spoke about this earlier, you talked about how being a poet kind of showed through when you were writing a story, or like your memoir.
Yeah.
But when you read your poetry in class, you really saw how it was constructed more like a traditional chapter of a novel might be. So I wanted to ask, where do you think a line can be drawn between poetry and a story, or do you think that there has to be a line?
So the question's about the form and the line between poetry and prose, essentially.
Yeah, so I think about the essays in Air Traffic as extended poems. I think about them as long poems. And so the logic behind them is very much elliptical, as Bob was saying. The difference is that the poems are more interested in the language. So poems will always have a narrative element, right? And so that's just a given. But what I'm interested more in the poem is the language and the play of the language than necessarily telling the story. So the way I think about the way I think about the world as a prose writer when I'm writing prose is, imagine that I'm standing inside the door. There's a screen door, and outside the door is a porch, and then a meadow, and let's have a horse trotting by. Beautiful, right? As a prose writer, I'm interested in telling the story of the horse trotting by. As the poet, I'm interested in the schmutz that's stuck on the screen door. Right? So everything that I see, the horse that I see, is mediated by the screen. That screen, in the analogy, is language itself. Right? I'm more interested in language. Of course, the horse is still going to be in it, but I'm more interested in the happy coincidences of raisin than I am in, saying this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened.
For the record, I taught him all the Yiddish that he knows. Schmutz.
Oh, that's right.
I did, actually.
No.
Next question was somebody over there.
There was a green sweater there.
Me, yeah.
So, if you were to choose someone in the book air traffic for one opportunity to make a movie, what would you name the actor?
I'm sorry, you're going to be louder.
Yeah. If you had the opportunity to make a movie about
Right.
your book air traffic, what actor would you choose?
So, not long after the book came out, I got a call from Plan B Productions, and that's the company that did Moonlight and 12 Years a Slave. And yeah, so we were talking about how would we do this, how would we structure the book as a film. And I texted my dad to tell him, and I'm sorry. No, that's not what it was. Okay, I'm sorry, I misremembered. It was after we sold the book Air Traffic to the publisher, I texted my dad to tell him. And my dad just texted back, Denzel Washington. That's all the text said. Of course, his suggestion was that he would be Denzel Washington. Played by Denzel Washington.
Well, his son, now he's got a son who's an actor, so that could work out. Denzel.
Oh, Denzel had a son in it.
Yeah. So Denzel could play your dad. He's getting gray.
That's true. That's true.
I forgot his first name, but he's the star of Black Lions.
I don't know who I cast. That is a fantastic idea. That would be so cool.
Next question. We got time for just a couple more. Ryan.
So you kind of touched like briefly on like how your experience of like shaped your politics and stuff. But do you think of like telling your story, like especially with having like your dad being part of the labor movement, do you see that in any way as being inherently political, or do you just see it as storytelling?
Yeah. Do I see telling my story as being itself inherently political? And yes, absolutely. I think all writing is a political act. Just saying, I have a voice, I exist, breaks through every assumption that we have about people. Right? Once we have access to someone's interior life, it's not possible for us to stereotype that person. I guess we could if we really tried, but you have to be really freaking ignorant to do that. But I think just the mere act of writing itself refuses stereotypes. Right? It says we are individuals with interior lives that are unique, and we should think about each other as such.
Question? Zach?
So there's a lot of kids who, like, when they're children, they think that they want to be a writer or a poet or something, and then they grow up, get to high school, and realize how hard it is to actually just write on your own and make a living that way. Then some people find out that they really want to do it and decide to go that path. So, especially with your father, with the lack of support from your father, and a lot of other elements in your life, how were you able to make that bridge where you were able to really find yourself and go after what you wanted?
That's a great question. Thanks. Yeah, so my grandfather, the same grandfather I've been talking about, when he retired, he was also a jazz musician, and I said earlier that everyone in my family either is in the arts or has some tangential thing in the arts, and he played jazz piano, and he always wanted to do that for good. And so when he retired, he bought a little bar in Pennsauken, New Jersey, and turned it into a jazz club. And I got to run the jazz club. And every weekend, there were these musicians who had devoted their lives to their instrument. They were brilliant, and and they would sit around and talk the way that we talk after playing, and they were engrossed in the music, and they had all these ideas about the music, and it was just fascinating to me that they did not seem interested in fame or any kind of celebrity, all the bling that goes along with that stuff that we think, that I thought one worked toward. And I would then at the end of the night hand each one of them like $50, right? I'm paying this guy or this woman who has all of this history of training and devotion to their craft, $50. And it took a while. It wasn't like an overnight aha, but that lesson, the lesson I took from that was there is another way to value life that is not measured by financial success. And that did blow my mind. And so when I dropped out of school, went back, dropped out of school, went back, and the third time that I finally went back, I said, well, I don't care. I love books. I love talking about books. I know I can at least put a roof over my head and feed myself. I'll be good. And once I did that, I call it my burning the boats moment. Right? I committed my life to literature. And it's worked out.
And that is a perfect place to stop. Thank you, Greg Pardlo.